benefit of making money off of providing an essential public service, but they had to also make these telephone stations available to the public as part and parcel. You take the bitter with the sweet. And some of the discussion that we've been having here today is not just, where should EV charging stations be, who should pay for them and the like, but also how we're going to take care of our less fortunate brothers and sisters who may not have the means necessarily to drive EV. We have faced this kind of question before, and it tees up an interesting issue of whether third-party charging station owners and operators ought to have some sort of public service obligation, even if they're not subject to a full complement of regulatory jurisdiction by the PUC. Next slide, please. Having some trouble getting there? Okay. I think it's also useful for focusing our discussion to remember one of the essential core purposes that the PUC has. And it's our friend James Bombright who brings that back to me. I'm going to quote here. Generally speaking, regulatory supervision is considered necessary for those enterprises which supply directly or indirectly continuous or repeated service through more or less permanent physical connections between the plant of the supplier and the premises of the consumer. This is a principle of regulation that the PUC reiterated both in 2012 and 2014 in the context of whether to construe Section 203, which is the statute that governs fundamentally the jurisdiction of the PUC over public utilities. And the factual context of the case was, in both instances, was whether natural gas truckers, meaning trucks that were loaded up with bottles of natural gas, to take to certain delivery points where they could be used by businesses and the like to get natural gas or compressed gas to run their operations. The PUC in both instances decided that it had jurisdiction under Section 203, but that it would not assert it because it didn't seem like it was necessary in order to fully effectuate their regulatory authority in the state. So one question for us today, or better said for the PUC to consider as it enters into this area, is whether that holding has application here, or whether it is something that is uniquely distinguishable from what we're trying to do with charging stations. So then, if we can go to slide 4. And I regret that the type is so small, but I thought it was interesting to put this up there. This is the text of the statute that basically sets out the jurisdictional authority of both the PUC and my department over certain public utilities. And this is a question, well, I should say two things. One, the language in that statute is not significantly different from similar regulatory statutory authority in other jurisdictions. And in over 20 states and the District of Columbia, I think, language of this nature has been construed to say that charging stations and the service provided through them does not fall within a PUC's regulatory jurisdiction. And so that's an interesting point for us to jump up on. On the other hand, just because it's been found to mean that in 20 other jurisdictions, including California, New York, and Massachusetts, though in Massachusetts by order as opposed to statute, that doesn't mean this PUC has defined it that way, although I would point out that Connecticut and Maine have as well. So with that, I'm going to turn to my panelists, and I'm going to ask you, have you prepared pieces that you would like to start off with your comments? Do I have a nod right there, a nod there, a nod there? Let's start with you, Kevin.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Tierney, and to Commissioners Cheney and Hoffman, and everyone here, really, PUC, Department of Public Service staff, and all the folks for their attention on these important issues. My name is Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy for ChargePoint. I cover policy issues from legislative to regulatory to everything is in the weeds as building codes issues, so I was very excited to hear everyone talk about that today. Which is a rarity to get excited about building codes, but I cover policy in the Northeast and the Midwest. And some of these issues on jurisdiction are really front and center, key and critical, and directly tied to some of the issues that my colleague John Gilbert presented on earlier today, given how dynamic and how changing the market is. So if we go to the next slide, that'd be great. So one of the things that I wanted to root this discussion on was making sure we all understand and appreciate the full ecosystem when it comes to transportation electrification, EV charging, EV drivers. There are a number of different ways in which connected, networked charging provides values to a whole host of different stakeholders. So on the driver side, one of the key issues is making sure that they're aware of, is the station available, is it up and running, are there prices associated with it. For site hosts, they want to be able to drive up utilization, because by and large, when site hosts, owners or operators or site hosts are putting a price for EV charging services, it's not as a means typically to earn a return on their investment and to make money off of the provision of charging services. Typically, charging services are provided as an amenity, either a benefit to employees or for attracting new customers. So using that price signal incentivizes folks to come and then to leave once charging is complete. And on the utility side, making sure that the load that comes on is shaped in a beneficial manner. And so keeping those three pieces in mind is really important when we think about how do we encourage sustainable roles for utilities, and how do we make sure that when we're regulating the right folks, and we're not treating drivers or site hosts as though they are public utilities themselves. If we go to the next slide, please. So one of the key pieces I wanted to point out here, I think I was actually hoping to gloss over this one, but so if we could go on further so we could stay on track. So utility engagement is vitally important. So just to say up front, really appreciate all the perspectives of the folks from Vermont's utility sector who presented on the value and the need for creating and increasing access to charging. It's possible to expand roles for utilities into the competitive market if it's done so in a way that complements the market. And it's not an either or. And one of the things that I want to point to is that it's really important to frame the questions up first correctly, that we're not trying to answer the question of whether we should have expanded access to charging or whether we should do it, but how we should do it. And the key questions that are more along the how, the method, the process, two that I want to point out. I'm not just going to read off a bulleted list, but the one that connects directly to what Commissioner Tierney was talking about is who's setting the pricing charging services to drivers, and at what level are they setting that pricing. So as the Commissioner pointed out, pricing and the provision of electric vehicle charging services has been determined in 24 states in the District of Columbia, and it's about to be 25 in Iowa very shortly. They've determined either by statute or through a regulatory process that it's a service and not the sale, resale, distribution of electricity. They've gone further in some places where the decisions have been made in the regulatory body to determine, the definitions of charging do not constitute that of an electric plant. The method of providing the charging service it's conveyed through a cable with a connector. It's not conveyed over transmission wires. You're doing more than just providing electricity. Network services, like my colleague John explained earlier, constitute billing, load management, payment, a whole host of other issues that are that wraparound service. So when those determinations have taken place, it's been really critical to enshrine that so that we can make sure that we're not limiting the extent to which pricing can be set. Because if you inadvertently require or mandate a site host to only set pricing on an hourly basis, you're going to lead to inequitable charges in the provision of charging services. And you'll also limit access to the equipment itself. It's important even beyond the question of jurisdiction that the site host itself have the ability to determine pricing for charging services, because while load management is key, and we provide and partner with utilities around the country, including Green Mountain Power, to ensure that load management happens, EV charging is the combination of refueling and parking. So if you can't send a price signal to get the driver to leave once charging is complete, you're going to end up with a car that's parked there. It's going to block access for other folks. And just setting a flat per kilowatt hour price will not lead to the efficient use of the station. So I want to move right along to the next slide. Just to point these pieces out, that there's a whole host of issues around, if we're talking about expanding the role for electric utilities and setting forth the framework for doing so, as we've seen in a number of different states in the Northeast and around the country. It's important to make sure that there are some characteristics of programs which can be set through guidelines from the Commission such as is there the choice in equipment and network services that's provided to the program participants, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. You've seen all of the different charging companies and display the different types of services they provide. Making sure that we're providing that choice in equipment and services will be really valuable as we think about that layer of it. But I think I'm probably over time, so I appreciate it.
That's okay. And I think what we're going to do, Kevin, is jump over to Mr. Nolan, because in a nutshell, what I took from your comments was don't regulate us, a third-party provider, right? And we're not selling fuel, we're selling services.
Correct.
And I would just note for the audience and the commission that earlier we had the Union of Concerned Scientists up here referring to utilities as providing the fuel of transportation. So there isn't necessarily consensus about what the nature of electricity is here, but this is a decided viewpoint coming from the industry and the third-party providers. We're now, now going to hear from a utility on the subject. Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. And thanks to the Commission for inviting me to speak. I want to start by just saying I have a lot of sympathy for the electric vehicle providers who don't feel they should be regulated. Frankly, the municipal utilities have felt that way for many decades. We look at our brethren around the country, and Vermont's one of only a handful of states that regulates municipal utilities. So we don't always go the same direction as everyone else.
At the state level, yes. Go ahead,
That is
Ken.
correct. So I just wanted to just frame this discussion from that viewpoint. I think, go to the next slide, please. Our position on this is fairly simple. I'll put up the same Section 203 language on the next slide and dive into a little more specifics. But in a nutshell, I think Vermont Public Power Supply Authority's view as an entity that represents 12 municipal utilities here in the state, 30,000 customers, serving 60 different communities. Our view is that if you're selling electricity, you are a regulated utility. If you're not selling electricity, then you're not a regulated utility. So in cases where electric chargers are in someone's home and they're using it for themselves, if it's a business that is providing that free of charge to their employees, if it's a grocery store that's using charging as a way to draw a business in, but they're not charging for the electricity in the charging station itself, we don't consider those really subject to PUC jurisdiction. They should not be regulated as under the statute as we see it. But the minute you start saying, I have the opportunity to sell electricity, then you're going into a realm in which you're providing a public service to the state and its residents, and there's some obligations that come with that, at least in our view. Point out that the public sector doesn't always have the same incentives to meet the public good. The regulated utility essentially is forced to have, given the state regulatory environment. And we feel at least that consumer protection is a pretty vital role here. And it comes up in statute language around some cases where there have been exemptions granted. We'll touch on those in a second. And also just want to mention, I think you heard about this in the morning, 80% of charging is occurring at homes. So that's really where we feel public policy should be focused on, is the home and employer charging. Public charging is a lesser extent, and I think doesn't really drive the conversation here, from my viewpoint. Next one, Dan. So again, the 203 language, I've highlighted or bolded a little bit, and I just want to focus in on the fact that the relevant section of the statute we see is if you're undertaking the sale of electricity directly to the public, or power insofar as it relates to the use or occupancy of the public highways, then you fall under the statute. We think it's pretty clear. And if you fall under the statute, then you have to comply with Vermont's energy policy. And we believe that to the extent there are any changes made to that status quo, we should do so in the context of finding the path forward that best meets that state policy. It may be full deregulation, it may be full regulation, or something in between. I don't think we need to dwell on the next slide. I just want to hit a point at the bottom of it. As I've said, the municipals here in Vermont are fully regulated. As the commissioners know, the state has looked at deregulation of utilities numerous times and has pretty consistently and repeatedly found that deregulation of electric service is not in the state's best interest, jeopardizes the public good. And we think there are a couple of issues at play there. One is you have a tension between a number of state policies. In this case, we could see a significant tension between the deployment of distributed generation and the policies the state has around promoting distributed generation and policies to move electric vehicles forward, charging forward, particularly the net metering statute. Consumer protections, again, as I say, and the potential for differing rules. The bill that got put into the legislature last year actually would have exempted third-party providers, but required full regulation of charging stations for utilities. And that sets up differing rules and differing standards that can be problematic. Next slide, please. When we've talked about this, when I've talked to my neighbors, regulators, folks at the department, other utilities, I get a couple of examples keep getting brought up as to why we need to not regulate charging stations. And people say, well, we need to go to the gas station model. I would just point out gas stations are regulated. Their trucks that bring in fuel have to meet weight standards on the roads to make sure they don't destroy public infrastructure. They have their gas pumps validated, so the meters are confirmed to be accurate. There are consumer protections in place, and those who live in Chittenden County have spent a lot of time hearing about the monopoly effects of one or two large providers getting control of the market and the impacts that has on pricing. And I think the same potential exists with electric vehicle charging if you're not careful in how you structure the regulatory regime. I've also heard the campground exemption, which actually exists in statute at section 249A, and how essentially campgrounds are allowed to sell energy to people who stay in the campground. Well, if you read that section of statute, it actually still has a regulated model. Those campgrounds are required to sell their product, their electricity, at a non-profit basis. They're required to notify of any rate changes and changes in charges. They have to give notice to any people that are staying and using their service. They're subject to meter validation, and they have to have transparent billing. Let's just skip to the last slide, please. Yeah, it should be second one in. Yes, that's the one. So just to wrap up kind of the nutshell of where we see things, if you're not selling electricity and you put a charging station in, we believe that's essentially an appliance. It's no different than putting a refrigerator in your house or welder in your garage. If you're using the appliance on your own premise for your own use, really shouldn't be subject to jurisdiction. If you're selling electricity to the public, then that brings on a larger obligation. And we believe the Commission should really think thoughtfully when you're making changes to that structure to make sure that whatever regulatory regime is put in place for charging stations, make sure that they're going to meet the regulatory requirements for providing public good. And that includes demand response, customer protections, and so on. And we certainly believe that the PUC, given where they have in every other case with electricity, you should retain the oversight for rates, for consumer complaints, and for billing accuracy and meter verification. I'll stop there.
So, Ken, do you think charging stations that are owned and operated by third-party providers, not utilities, that they're selling electricity to the public?
If they're charging on a kilowatt hour or a kilowatt basis, I believe they're selling electricity to the public.
So, Matt, back to industry. You've heard Mr. Nolan's unvarnished view on the matter. What do you say?
All right. First, just thank you to Commissioner Tierney, Commissioner Cheney, and Commissioner Hoffman, and the entire organization for taking up this important topic. So Matt Stanberry, Advanced Energy Economy, for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we are a multi-tech business association representing a large number of companies in the clean energy space. In the transportation electrification space, we work with charging infrastructure companies, auto OEMs from light-duty vehicles all the way up to heavy-duty, fleet owners and operators, smart grid companies that work on integration of these technologies, and digital technology firms working in the marketplace. Just 2 weeks ago, we released a paper called EVs 101, a regulatory plan for America's electric transportation future, which is focused on the regulatory matters that relate to EVs, and I think could be helpful on a number of the issues that were raised today, and I'm happy to provide anybody a copy of that if they are interested. But I want to take today to give you a quick view of this particular issue. We write on jurisdictional issues in the paper. In order to do that, I want to put it in context for the way we think about this space. First, two contextual points. We believe that transportation electrification has been discussed on all of the panels today, provides both significant benefits to drivers of electric vehicles, but also for ratepayers as penetration levels rise. We also, of course, believe that they provide significant levels of societal benefit as well. And the second contextual point is that there was a question asked before, are we in a chicken and the egg moment, and which one's the chicken and which one's the egg? I think that the data shows us that we have a charging infrastructure challenge right now, and there's pretty good market data that show that. It was mentioned before. I'll just cite one for the record. There's a recent consulting report. Altman and Valandry and Company do work in this space, and they did a survey of individuals who are car buyers. And they found that folks who are actually aware of plug-in electric vehicles as an option when they're buying a vehicle, 85% of survey respondents cited a lack of charging infrastructure as a reason that they are not currently buying an electric vehicle. So with that as context, we're at an early stage of the EV market, and so we believe that it's important that all capital resources should be brought to bear in this market, including private capital, utility investments, Volkswagen settlement funds, to name a few. We believe that that approach will create a virtuous cycle of increased charging infrastructure, leading to accelerated EV adoption and ultimately increasing utilization of that charging infrastructure. So with that as our background thinking, we think there are incredibly important roles for both third-party charging companies like Kevin's and for utilities to play in this marketplace. We do think that third parties should be able to develop, own, and operate charging facilities, and we believe that they should be able to sell electricity specifically for the purpose of charging vehicles without sale for resale issues. We believe they're providing a different service. At the same time, we think that utilities have an incredibly important role, including ownership and operation of PEV charging infrastructure under appropriate rules and market conditions when there's a failure of the marketplace to provide sufficient services, as we see in significant portions of the EV charging infrastructure business today. Largely driven by the fact that we have relatively low penetration of vehicles in the marketplace today. It's simply the case that the market itself can't deliver charging infrastructure for all customers, classes, uses, and geographies. So in our viewpoint, the goal of regulators, it should be to eliminate underlying market barriers to facilitate the development of an expanded market for charging infrastructure and to accelerate the deployment of charging infrastructure while simultaneously ensuring the provision of services that are outside the reach of the current market. With that as context, I know folks were interested in some of the things that are happening around the country on both the question of third-party regulation, but also of different utility roles. But I think, given timing, I'll wait. I do have some information that I can share on that, but I think we should hammer out the questions around this particular topic with the opening statements first.
I think for the sake of symmetry, it's time to go back to my left. So, Joni, why don't you share with us your opening remarks? You need a microphone? Okay.
Well, hello, and thank you all for inviting us. I'm here on behalf of the Regulatory Assistance Project. Some of you may know us, but for those who don't, RAP is an independent, nonpartisan, non-governmental organization that is dedicated to accelerating the transition to a clean, reliable, and efficient energy future. In plainer terms, we don't own or operate charging stations, and we're not interested in doing that, so I will be the independent in the middle of this table, along with the commissioner, of course. But that's us, and today I'll continue this conversation. Next slide, please. So to give a brief outline, I'll state the question as I see it, explain how a couple of states have gone about answering it, and then talk about how we view Vermont could go about answering that. And for that, I really want to discuss two experiences that Vermont has already had that I think are of importance for this discussion. And after that, I'll just provide some concluding thoughts. Next slide, please. So, the way we see it is EV charging stations, when owned by a third-party provider, are like regulated utilities in that they are selling electricity by the kilowatt hour. And the question, in simple terms, is does that mean they should be regulated the same way as a public utility? Does that mean they shouldn't be regulated at all? Or should they be somewhere in the middle? And maybe that could be something like certified by a competitive retail service provider. Thank you. So generally, we've seen states handle this in kind of two ways. Either the legislation has spoken and issued a law, or a regulatory entity in the state has issued some ruling. And as has been said, the general trend we've seen is that they've said they're not the same as a public utility. But that still doesn't mean that there's no room for regulatory oversight, and there is still room for consumer protections to be built in. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, here in Vermont, the first analogy is campground submetering, as Ken mentioned. If you've ever taken a camper out to a campground here, you'll know that you can plug in and get electricity, and you'll get a charge by the kilowatt hour from whoever runs the campground. You might find that odd since we're discussing how can this happen. But there is a provision that states under law, campgrounds are allowed to submeter electricity. But we don't consider them the same as a public utility. There are other rules. There is the law, the provisions, as Ken mentioned, and a set of regulations that's been issued by the Commission, laying out what needs to happen for that to be allowed. Thank you. The second issue I want to, or not issue, but instance that I want to bring up was a docket that the commission heard back when it was the Public Service Board, back in the 90s and early 2000s. And this is a case about jurisdiction. It all came when a federal law was passed that said that regulatory entities in the states no longer had permission to regulate the rates or entry of wireless carriers. And one of the companies came and said, well, that federal law means you don't regulate us anymore. We don't have to comply with these other provisions. And in this case, the commission found that even though certain things couldn't be regulated, that didn't mean it had lost authority over other terms and conditions of service. Next slide, please. And I think when we talk about retaining authority, it's really about dealing with these, acknowledging when there could be worst-case scenarios or things that are unexpected. Not to say that there are bad entities, but that there is the potential for someone to do that. And kind of ask this question of, if you can see that photo, I apologize, the font is so small. But this was a sign one of my coworkers found at a mall with a posting of, if you're an electric vehicle charger and you want to charge here, it's going to cost you $1.50 per kilowatt hour. So if that is the sale of electricity, is it okay that that is almost 10 times the price of the electricity? And I will allow, there certainly could be other things bundled into that charge that are parking or other services. But is this a situation that we want someone arriving at the mall to be encountering this sign? Next slide, please. So broad conclusions. In our view, the legislation that grants the commission's jurisdiction is very broad. It could be changed. Either the legislation could issue a law, or the commission could issue a ruling saying it doesn't want to exercise its jurisdiction to the fullest extent. But whatever happens, we would urge that people keep in mind when consumer protections are necessary, and balance that with ensuring we're keeping in mind what Vermont's long-term electrification goals are. Charging services are going to be necessary to electrifying our transportation sector, so we want to make sure that whatever we do is helping to grow that market. Next slide, please. And I apologize again, this is quite small, but I just wanted to let you know if you want more on what I've spoken today, it's covered in one of our publications, which is available free online. It's called Getting From Here to There, Regulatory Considerations for Transportation Electrification. And there's some other chapters on rate design, appropriate role of the utility, and some other topics. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joni. I've spent quite a bit of time with that publication. Dan, you have only recently joined us here in Vermont, but it's your turn. What are your observations on the topic?
Thanks. I am Nathaniel.
Excuse me.
That's okay. Just figured we should start out with an easily answerable question before we get on the more thorny.
What's your name?
So before I get in, let me just say, Commissioner Tierney and the department staff that put this together, thank you for putting together a panel that has not just differing viewpoints, not just differing lenses through which we view a common problem, but actually differing views on what the state can and cannot do. And this is just the sort of direct and civil discussion that is frankly refreshing. So thank you for putting this together. With that in mind, I will say that the Sierra Club, and we've been engaging with this particular set of jurisdictional questions with regulators across the country for several years. We are ownership agnostic when it comes to charging infrastructure. We do not have a view on whether ownership is it is better or more ideal to have ownership housed within utilities or housed strictly in private sector. That said, we do have a view on the Commission's jurisdiction, and it has been, I think, Commissioner Tierney, you started by saying something like the language in 203 is not significantly different from language in other states in D.C., and we agree. We think that that language in 203 that deals with lighting, heating, or power is substantially the same and meaningfully the same as the light, heat, or power language that you find in New York and Massachusetts and other states. And to that point, this first map is a look at the jurisdictions across the country that have made just this sort of determination, where the State Utility Commission does not exercise jurisdiction over third-party infrastructure providers just by virtue of them providing that service. And that I think is the appropriate interpretation of the statute, is that they're not providing electricity per se, but what they're doing is providing a service to people that show up and plug in. Now, that being said, I think there certainly is a role. As I said, there's both a role for the private sector and for utilities here. One other point of contention, I think, and something for this commission to wrestle with is not just ownership structure, but whether regulation or control or authority over those charging stations should differ based on whether the sale of electricity is by the hour versus the kilowatt hour. And the Sierra Club's viewpoint is that it shouldn't matter whether the sale is per minute or per unit of energy. We don't think that the commission should be exercising jurisdiction over third-party providers of electric vehicle infrastructure. So then the second point that I'd like to make is just that we do think that the commission ought to retain jurisdiction over otherwise regulated utilities. And Dan, if you go to the second map, you'll see there's roughly 24, 25 states have made a similar determination. Sometimes it's by commission order, sometimes it's by legislation. The strong trend in this country, and one that we think is appropriate for Vermont to make, is that where utilities are investing ratepayer dollars in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the commission ought to exercise appropriate oversight and ensure that those investments are structured to benefit all ratepayers, whether they own an electric vehicle or not. They should be structured to benefit the grid because they can be, but they won't necessarily. That is not something that is necessarily going to happen. It takes some direction, some guidance. And then third, to ensure that there are price signals that actually encourage EV use and benefit EV drivers themselves. And with that, I think I will stop under time. How's that?
Bummer. Do the commissioners have any questions of the panel at this point?
I do. I'm struggling somewhat with our statute, and when I use electricity in my home, you're saying when you're providing a service and you're doing a charge point. Why is that different than my using electricity in my home, and that's a service, so my refrigerator will run?
I think that there are all kinds of services one provides to a family. My son would agree that I provide him short order cook services. No, I mean, to your question, it's valid. What is the purpose of the energy use, and how is that happening, and what is the context in which that's happening? Whether you view it as the sale of electricity or not, is key to looking at the statute and how you interpret that piece. I agree with everything that the gentleman from VPPA said, is that if you follow that statutory provision, that you shouldn't resell electricity for any of those purposes. But I disagree entirely that this is the provision, or this is the resale of electricity. It's not related to the transmission, distribution of electricity for light, heat, or power. It's used to provide a discrete service that can only be used for one thing, charging a vehicle. It requires specialized equipment to allow the customer to do that one thing, charging. The primary purpose of the transaction between that charging station site host and driver is the purchase of the service used through this specialized equipment, and holding aside whether or not it is the sale of electricity. There are several additional public policy reasons why it would be in the public interest to allow for pricing to include a per kilowatt hour fee, not one or the other. It's found that a combination of a per kilowatt hour fee plus a time-based or a session-based fee will lead to the most optimal utilization and increased access to stations. It ties the consumption of the energy to the EVSE energy used, creates equity amongst different cars because different cars charge at different rates. So if you're limited to setting pricing on an hourly basis, that is inequitable. So I think there is a fundamental difference between those two pieces, and I think the consumer protection arguments that are brought up are really valid, but those don't hinge. Providing consumer protection doesn't hinge on treating the provision of a service like the sale of electricity. There are statutes in the Northeast where you maintain open access to charging stations to make sure that anyone can use a public charging station, and that there are weights and measures, evaluations to ensure that any price that is set is accurate. So I think there's a lot contextually that's different, Commissioner.
And I can see Mr. Nolan wants to answer too.
Would you like to yield to Mr.
Yes, I
Nolan?
would.
Okay.
Thank you. I find it striking that the folks who quote the section of statute stop at the word power, and they leave off the last part of that sentence, which says, and so far as it relates to their use and occupancy of the public highways. To me, that's very clear that deals with electric vehicles, but we stop at the power and say, well, this is not related. So the Commission should really read that section of statute and think about how you envision it. To your example of the home, I would frame it this way. If you take electricity from a utility and you use it to heat your home or run your refrigerator for your own use, you're not selling it to anyone else, you're not providing it to anyone else, you're not a utility. If you put an extension cord on the outside of your home and put a meter on and run it to your neighbor next door and provide them electricity off from your meter, all of a sudden you at least become a campground subject to regulation. And I would argue you potentially are an electric utility because you're selling kilowatt hours to another customer. That's the issue that we run into when we look at the statute and say, absent some change in the way the underlying statute is structured, the service they're talking about, whether you add parking or anything else, if you're selling kilowatt hours, you're an electric utility.
Commissioner Cheney, Joe, question.
I do. I have a question, I think, for Matt. You mentioned quite clearly that we have a charging infrastructure challenge. Do you think that this topic we're discussing now is a threshold issue to meeting that challenge? In other words, is the question of how to define that third-party provider, whether as a traditionally regulated utility and all that goes along with it, or some other model, key to meeting that challenge, that charging infrastructure challenge?
There you go.
I do. I think in the paper I referenced before, I mean there are certain sort of fundamental issues to market structure that are important for all actors to understand at the outset, because financing decisions are made. Locational specific decisions around where to provide financing or not are made on the basis of market structure issues. And I think actually it's true for the utility space and for utilities in other states. For example, we almost have the reverse conversation in some ways, where if you look at California for a lot of years, California has been at the EV game for a long time. I think somebody correct me if I misquote this, but I think last year on the light duty market, they were about 6.5% of total vehicle sales, about right. For California, nationally, it's 1%. So they've been doing a lot of work in this space. For a long time, they were pretty hesitant about utilities having a role in charging infrastructure. Over time, there was a lot of learning that went on in the state as they started setting more serious targets around EVs, and then started understanding what the charging requirements were to support those EVs and the effect of a lack of charging infrastructure was having on adoption, they started to get the utilities more engaged. And now if you look at the programs that are in place and proposed in California, you have hundreds of millions of dollars of approved projects that now have a full complement of utility roles. Everything from make-ready rebate programs to full ownership and operation of charging. And so I say this from the perspective of everybody's got to know certain fundamental rules of the road so that they can direct their dollars accordingly. And I think this is one of those issues.
Just add to that briefly. I would agree entirely that it is a threshold issue that must be engaged with. Recently, the Pennsylvania PUC, for this very reason, cited this threshold lack of clarity in the market. The inability for site hosts to know whether they were going to be regulated like a public utility as a barrier to them entering into the market. And this can apply for something like a public agency who is prevented from being able to provide benefits to one class of employee versus another. So if they're not able to set a fee for the amount of energy used to provide that service, they won't be able to install those stations. What becomes even more pressing, and we heard a lot earlier about the DC fast charging issues and the problems that arise not just from the upfront capital costs, but from the ongoing operating costs. If one is barred from reflecting the amount of energy on a per kilowatt hour basis that's used, you're not going to get DC fast charging in Vermont, because a site host is going to be limited to setting pricing on an hourly basis. And if a Tesla pulls up next to a Chevy Volt, they have different capacities to accept a charge, but they're going to be charged the same price. So the economic challenges that you heard about operating the station become that much more unpredictable and untenable if you're not able to reflect how much energy is used to provide the charging service.
So what I'm hearing from the panel so far is that there's a pressing need for an answer as to whether the PUC asserts jurisdiction. And what I'm hearing from Mr. Nolan in particular is the language that exists in statute right now decidedly goes in one direction, and so perhaps needs to be changed in order to eliminate the concerns that you have. Is that fair, Ken?
Yes, in simple terms. I think if you read the statute on its face as it's written today, it would imply that the full host of utility regulation applies to EV chargers when you sell electricity. So the problem that was described a second ago is valid. I think there are places where that can be changed, the campground model, for example. But I think my main point was you need to really think through what levers the regulatory regime is giving up when you do that. And rather than just say, no, it's not regulated, it's a service, we don't have any control at all, Vermont has never done that. So I think whenever we've looked at this question, we've decided that there is some level of restraint required for the public good. And I think that's the trick, is to find where that balance is.
Well, in my own reading for this panel, I was struck by the idea that has been circulated in some circles that perhaps it's not a question of abandoning all regulation of charge stations if the PUC doesn't assert jurisdiction, but rather that it is a different entity that asserts jurisdiction. For instance, a state AG for consumer protection, or transportation department for weights and measures and the like. So it is worth the PUC considering whether it has to be the agency that necessarily asserts jurisdiction. And I would just point to bond right again as a reminder that the PUC's jurisdiction principally initially is about economic regulation. And so query the need here for economic regulation of third-party stations and their operators. But a question for industry here, meaning, and by industry I mean third-party owners and operators of charging stations. Does it make a difference to you whether the clarity that you say you need comes via an administrative order or a statutory exemption? Especially in a state where we already have an example of a statutory exemption that takes away some of the concerns that Mr. Nolan's talking about.
From ChargePoint's perspective, first, we never end up setting pricing. So this doesn't directly impact us. It directly impacts our customers and our site hosts. But in terms of how we do it, I'm more agnostic about how we achieve that clarity. There needs to be that clarity at the end of the day, and I've supported statutory processes to ensure that third-party site hosts are not regulated like public utilities. I've also supported regulatory determinations outside of statute.
So in the interest of time, can I jump very quickly to Matt, and then to Joni, and then to
Daniel?
Tom for quick answers to the same question. So Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll defer my time because I don't think I have an additional perspective to the one that Kevin just laid out.
Okay, how about you, Joni? Your presentation said either by statutory change or administrative order. Now speak. What do you think is preferable?
I'll start by saying I think I am also agnostic. I think it's great that the state of Vermont is in this position of asking for a recommendation on the legislation. But I do want, if I can borrow my time, to bring it back, follow your example of focusing on the history and where we got here, and specifically on the campground submetering. I bring that up not because it exists and it's interesting that it's a current law, but because there was a discussion on how should electricity in campgrounds be charged, and we want it to be economically efficient, and that means charging by the kilowatt hour, because that is what is the most fair to campground users. Not to say to camp, you're going to have to pay $50 more at night, but to say campground owners can charge you by the kilowatt hour. And I think that history is what I hope to bring across.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nathaniel, did I get it right?
From the environmental perspective, I don't think it matters.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. I think we're at time just about, unless the commissioners have any more questions.
We have 3 minutes left, so if there were a 1.5-minute question followed by a 1.5-minute answer.
From the public at large, perhaps? Anyone out there? Do we have any takers? Please, come forward, if you wouldn't mind coming to the lectern.
Stand up.
I guess in terms of where the money goes.
Can I get your name, please?
My name is Brian. I have been a past leaseor of an EV. And
what's your last name?
Garrison, Garrison.
Thanks.
So I guess the question of where the money goes, so does it go to the site host, or does it go to ChargePoint, the third party? Because generally, when I would plug in my card, it would say, okay, well, I'm paying this company the money, and so then how do the site hosts factor into that versus the campground rule? If you have the site is the one who's getting that money, and so how that all kind of factors into where the regulation should lie.
It's a great question, and I'll break tradition, and I will stay in time. It's really important, so thanks for bringing it up. We process credit card transactions on behalf of our site hosts, and they retain those proceeds. We have a fee that we pass through like most credit card processing entities. It's really important for that site host to be the one who sets the price to incentivize the proper use of the station.
One more comment.
I'll just add one. It depends on the model, too, of the charging station operator. So there are own and operate charging station operators, in which case the funds go to them.
That's correct. And even regardless of ownership, even in cases like in California where utilities do own stations, in those cases the site hosts themselves still have the ability to determine the pricing because they're able to influence that charging behavior. And on the pricing, one last piece, I broke my promise, I'm over time. The sandwich board on $1.50 a kilowatt hour is something that I have seen, and it makes the rounds in proceedings, and it has for a few years. I really do want to characterize that that's anecdotal. in the extreme, the data do not bear out that being a trend or let alone more than the one-off. It's a great picture, though. It's very frightening.
Thanks, Kevin. It also makes the point that it is possible. So I think we're done. Thank you so much. Oh, yes, Commissioner Cheney.
Just to remind you, we have a 10-minute break, and we're going to have a panel of people who have already been on panels. And I'd like to just give you a heads up, if you're going to be up here, think about the one thing you would suggest as being the key to do first. If you also have in your pocket number 2 or number 3 in case someone else mentions your number 1. So we'll be back here at 2:40.
And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So we just made the